Yes. Mohananda, you can start.
Okay, thank you, sir. Good morning, everyone. Today is the day 5 lecture program of the add-on course on History of English Literature, organized by Department of English under the aegis of IQAC Krishna Chandra College, Hetampur, Birbhum. Today, in this program, we have with us our head of the Department of English, also the coordinator of this add-on course program, Dr. Arnab Ghosh. Also present here, our senior faculty member and joint convener of this program, Mr. Noim Akhtar. Also present, the secretary of this program, Mr. Anirban Singh, and most importantly, present here, our today's honorable resource person for whom we have been waiting to hear his valuable lecture, Dr. Arnab Chatterjee, assistant professor, and also the teacher in charge, Harishchandrapur College, Sipla. Welcome you, sir, to this add-on course program. And finally, our dear participants, our former students, present students of the Department of English, and all the students from every corner of the state and outside. I, Mahananda Bormon, the convener of this program, eagerly welcome you all to this add-on course program on History of English Literature. And thank you all for your presence and for your cooperation. I hope you have been enjoying and enlightening yourself from this program. So, without delay, now it is the time for the presentation of our today's honorable research person. And you know very well that he will share his views on 18th century literature and Enlightenment. So, before inviting him here, we would like to specially welcome and introduce our today's honorable resource person. So, to welcome and introduce our today's research person, Dr. Arnab Chatterjee, I would now like to call our HOD sir, our coordinator of this program, Dr. Arnab Ghosh. Sir, please proceed. Over to you.
Thank you, Mohananda. Thank you so much. Today is the 5th day of the add-on course, and today we have amongst us Dr. Arnab Chatterjee. Arnab is a young scholar, and apart from being a meritorious student, he is also a great administrator also in this particular young age. So Arnab, welcome to our college virtually. Welcome to the 5th day of our add-on course. Dr. Arnab Chatterjee is an assistant professor and as well as teacher in charge of Harishchandrapur College, Malda. He is a very meritorious student, and he received his first award from Vishwabharati examination in the master degree course, and he also received Anjali Nandi Memorial Prize from the English Language Lovers Association, West Bengal, for securing highest marks in English among the male candidates in the master degree examination. He has completed his PhD under Professor, the famous scholar Amrit Sen from Vishwabharati University, and he also worked on 18th century literature. He has many publications to his credit, and amongst them the most famous is Narrating Cultural Encounter, Representations of India by Select Enlightenment Women Writers, which has been published from Routledge, UK edition. And he wrote many chapters and articles in many edited volumes as well as in many journals and magazines. So there are many. I don't want to burden you with the names of all these writings. So I do welcome Arnab in our college. Thank you, Arnab, for giving us time. Plan ছিল যে physically meet করব, কিন্তু virtually meet করছি। Arnab বলবে on Enlightenment and 18th century literature, which is a very interesting and intriguing period spanning a large portion of the 18th century, and which marks a significant intellectual and cultural shift in the Western civilization, particularly in the realm of the literature. And this era witnessed a flourishing of the English literature, characterized by an array of the literary forms, including novels, essays, plays, and poetry, and writers like giants like Jonathan Swift, Alexander Pope, John Dryden, Samuel Johnson grappled with the social, political, and philosophical questions of their time, employing satire, wit, rationality to critique and reform the society. So over to Arnab. Arnab এই বিষয়গুলো আমার থেকে অনেক বেশি জানে, অনেক ভালো বলবে। Arnab, you can use, of course, bilingual mode. তুমি দুটো ভাষাতেই বলতে পারো, তুমি তোমার মতো করে বলবে।
Okay. Thank you, Professor Arnab Ghosh and Mananda Bormor, for your kind introduction. I was wondering whether I really deserve this. I was wondering whether I deserve these words or not. Without much ado, let me move on straight to the topic. So, as declared by Arinanda, I will speak on Enlightenment and 18th century literature. So, first of all, you see, this term Enlightenment actually is roughly a translation of a French term used by D'Alembert, because D'Alembert called the 18th century l'âge de lumière. La L H, AGE DES LUMIERS. That is the age of light, the age of knowledge, the age of enlightenment. The age of light, the age of knowledge, the age of enlightenment. Now, few have captured the spirit of the Enlightenment, its intellectual and social agenda, as has Mozart, MOZART, in his operas. In one of his operas titled The Magic Flute, with its secular priests presiding over temples of wisdom, reason, and nature, is a series of variation on the triumph of light over darkness, of day over night, of reason, tolerance, and love over passion, hate, and revenge. Similarly, the marriage of Figaro, another text, is a rendering of Enlightenment social ideals, a lyrical hymn to the individualistic claims of self-made, assertive men who achieved their place through hard labor, hard work, skill, and talent, as opposed to hereditary privileges of the aristocrats. Therefore, you can see that there is a rise of what we call possessive individualism during this period. A lot of paradigm shifts were taking place in history, in philosophy, in science, and it exerted tremendous influence on the epistemology and ontology of the period. And obviously it shifted to the other areas. Now, you see that reason became the catchword of the day. If I ask you to tell a single word that defines the Enlightenment, it is, of course, reason, rationality. And rationality laid down the paradigm of modernity. So many things came into play. You have clubs, you have coffee houses, you have the rise of print culture, you have improved condition of roads, you have circulating libraries, which, just change the way you think of your life, the way the West, thought the definition of life. Now, of course, the Enlightenment was an international movement that included French, English, Scottish, American, German, Italian schools. Now, Voltaire and Montesquieu visited England and wrote extensively about its institutions. Franklin and Jefferson visited England and France and were all connected with writers in both countries. The intellectual format, the point that I would like to drive at home is the intellectual format was transnational. Now, John Adams wrote his defense of the Constitution of the United States of America in response to criticism from the philosopher Turgot, and Smith's Wealth of Nations was translated into French by Condorcet. Now, Mozart's operas as Enlightenment icons epitomize the internationalism of the movement as well. The Austrian composer used Figaro, a literary invention of the Frenchman, in addition to his writing La Marquise de Figaro in 1778. So dating an intellectual movement like the Enlightenment is never precise. Now, we have categorized periods of history of English literature for the sake of convenience of our reading. But we cannot believe in a kind of, watertight division that this is Enlightenment, this is Romantic, this is modern. So the tendencies of one age may overlap with the other. And therefore, dating an intellectual movement like the Enlightenment is never precise. But, of course, a rough guide would emphasize the 100+ years from 1680s to the 1790s. I will largely concentrate on the English context, and this is for the students. May I ask you the significance of the year 1660 in history of English, or history of England rather? Can anyone tell me what happened in 1660?
Restoration period.
Yes, restoration of what? Thank you. Taposh.
Monarchy.
Restoration of what?
in that time, monarchy back in the England.
Monarchy, right. Restoration of monarchy. Now, who came to the English throne?
Charles the Second.
Charles the Second.
Charles II, right. Charles II. Charles II was invited by the parliament, and he returned from exile, right? So the restoration of monarchy in this marks the restoration of monarchy in England. Now, apart from this restoration of monarchy, can you tell me any other significance of the restoration?
The glorious revolution was took
No.
place.
Revolution took place in 1688. That's a different issue. I'm talking about restoration, the significance, the historical significance of the year 1660.
Any other historical literary significance of the year 1660 that we have remembered?
Bishops.
Actually, the word restoration has three distinctive, significances rather. One is political, that you have already pointed out brilliantly. The second is theatrical. Because, with the arrival of Charles II, theaters were also restored. The Puritans didn't allow theatrical performances due to their rigid views on social morality. So, in 19th July 1660, a draft of the theatre was published. But another significance is that is religious significance. Now, why have I mentioned it? Because you see, the Church of England was restored. Therefore, it is a restoration in three senses of the term: the political, the theatrical, and the religious. So after Charles II, James I came to the throne. So people had to choose between the church and the state. And people do not talk about James II because James II is not a very, impressive king. Now, you see, amidst the restoration, Charles II, with the arrival of Charles II, it marked a significant, the arrival of Charles II marked a significant phase in British political as well as literary history. So, amidst the spontaneous, outbursts of joy, poets and others were not slow in, asserting a parallel between this restoration and the imperial establishment after civil wars of Octavius Augustus Caesar in Rome. So this attitude can be seen in Dryden's famous poem Astrea Redux, composed for the occasion of restoration, where Dryden says, "O happy age, O times like those alone, by fate reserved for great Augustus' throne, when the joint growth of arms and arts pursue the world of a monarch and that monarch you." So you see how Dryden is eulogizing Charles II. So this is a major historical event. But you see, before restoration, if you see that before restoration, the age that we usually talk about in the history of English literature is, of course, the Puritan interregnum or Commonwealth period. The timeline is usually, historians may vary, 1649 to 1660. Now, can anyone tell me the significance of 1649? Why 1649 is an important date?
Charles I was executed.
Yes, the Republicans beheaded Charles I. Good. And then the major historical, phenomenon that exerted tremendous influence on English social and political as well as literary history is, of course, the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Now, James II was replaced by William of Orange and his wife Mary. Historically speaking. Now, you see, this movement was engineered by the middle class. And this laid down the basis of democracy in England, because it talked about the power of the parliament. Earlier, you see, there was tremendous backlash between the king and the parliament. But the Glorious Revolution obviously triggered is a sense of, what the principles of democracy is. It is a real watershed in the history of England. Because it settled the issue of succession, it defined the power of monarchy, and the status of the Church of England and its relationship with the Protestant descent. It redefined the acceptable spheres of royal and parliamentary court. And therefore, it is a highly important historical event. You see, this idea of democracy is very important in this age, because you see, rights, Enlightenment initiated a set of discourses on rights, individual rights, in the collective sense of the term. You have the notion of habeas corpus, which means have a body. An individual cannot be arrested without the warrant of a law court. আমি তোমাকে অ্যারেস্ট করতে পারবো না, এর আগে যদি এলিজাবেথের নামে কিছু বলতে বা জেমস ফার্স্টের নামে কিছু বলতে, তোমার মুন্ডুচ্ছেদ হতে পারত। But now, the king cannot arrest you arbitrarily. So, an individual cannot be arrested without the warrant of a law of the court. So you see, law is emerging as secular, non-monarchical institution. I do admit that the king still have power, but slowly power was, passing both to the parliament and to the courts. So along with the habeas corpus actually ensured what we call individual right. So this Enlightenment unleashed a whole discourses of human of individual right and belief in human perfectibility. Act of toleration was there, which reduced the gulf between religious sects, and philosophy moved towards secularism. Society moved towards a tolerant attitude and wanted to ensure individual freedom. There was a rise of public sphere. Certain spaces opening up in the 18th century. People are coming together in a body and expressing their opinion. And this public sphere, suppose they are going to the clubs and coffee houses, exchanging their opinion. And that was both real and virtual. Now you see, now we are in a public sphere, but that is altogether virtual sphere. And this public sphere reflected the opinion of the public. And it also paved the way for a deluge of print culture in the 18th century. So historically speaking, this age, the glorious revolution, the restoration, so you have so many changes in terms of historical, you have so in terms of history of the period. In this age, the period from 1702 to 1714, it's the age of Queen Anne, not a very popular age, but you can see references to Queen Anne in your literary texts. So if you read Rape of the Lock, you will see that how elemental tea was taken with Queen Anne. Even Alexander Pope has a very famous text called Windsor Forest, where he said, "She said, and the world eulogized the king." So you see, usually Enlightenment is seen as the harbinger of political stability. But England was certainly, and as well as the entire Europe, didn't enjoy that kind of political stability that we often talk about while talking about the Enlightenment. Because you see, after Queen Anne's death in 1714, George I ascended to the throne in accordance with the Act of Parliament of 1701. And this is known as the beginning of the Hanoverian age. Beginning of the Hanoverian age. Now, you see, he favored the Whigs because the Tories hesitated to support the Protestant succession, whereas the Whigs supported it wholeheartedly. Now, George I died in 1727, and his son George II ruled the country for over 3 decades until his death in 1716. So George I was a German and who could speak little English, and George II failed to exercise his authority. So this age saw a significant change in the role of Parliament because of the roles of responsible ministers. So during the reigns of George I and George II, the Whig party, 18th century is also known as the age of party politics. It witnessed the rise of 2 political parties, Whigs and Tories. So the Whig party enjoyed an unquestionable superiority to the Tory party and was able to dominate England for almost a period of 30 years. Now, exactly in the middle of the century, if you remember, two important things happened. One is the campaigns of Lord Clive in India, roughly from 1756 to 1760, and the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, which comes. So when George I came into power, England had become a superpower with its colonies in America and India. But George III was not the kind of king who'd allow the country to be run by parliament and the ministers. He tried to assert the royal power. He even began the practice of not attending, cabinet meetings. So in 1762, the Duke of Newcastle was dismissed, and with it ended the era of Whig dominance. So George II was greatly influenced by his tutor, Marquess of Bute, who was a Scottish steward. He succeeded the Duke of Newcastle and concluded the 7 Years' War with France by the Peace of Paris. The Bute, however, resigned in 1763, and George Grenville became the Prime Minister. Earlier, you can see 1729, Robert Walpole as the Prime Minister. So he passed the Stamp Act in 1765 in order to meet, expenses of the British Army in America. And it gave birth to riots all over America, which ultimately culminated in the American War of Independence. It was followed by the French Revolution and the fall of Bastille in 1789. So actually, as a result of the union of Tory and King towards the end of the century, revolutionary thoughts grew in England. The fall of Bastille got enthusiastic support from the English people, though the later excesses of the revolution disillusioned them. You can think about Wordsworth and Coleridge, for example, who lost their faith in the revolution and thought how the revolution ultimately resulted mere anarchy and bloodshed. So broadly speaking, the 18th century was an age of peace and prosperity, political stability, moderation, and common sense. But it had its political and historical instabilities as well. This was one side of the coin. And on the other side of the coin, there was self-indulgence, material greed, and spiritual lassitude. Robbery on the roads was a common thing. Now you have a whole set of criminal biography, you have a whole set of whore biography in this period. So fighting duels was another popular but dangerous custom of the soldiers and the upper class people. Drunkenness and gambling, were also there. The problem of foundlings became so acute that, being moved by this, Captain Coral founded his foundling hospital in 1750. If you read Fielding's Tom Jones or Joseph Andrews, you will see that the issue of the foundling will be repeatedly discussed. So it is, however, known as also the age of hospitals. Jenner discovered the cowpox vaccine, and the Hunter brothers transformed the British surgery from the unsophisticated medieval trade of barber surgeon into some kind of what we call formidable science. Now, several schools were established throughout the century. The Anglicans established charity schools to counteract the activities of the dissenters, who started their own schools as they were excluded from the universities. The agitation against slave trade was another important feature of the 18th century. The Abolition Society was founded in 1787, and almost after 50 years in 1838, slavery was finally abolished in British Empire. So this age witnessed a slow but steady change from agrarian economy to a highly industrialized one. And as a result, middle classes formed, mainly the merchants and the professionals, became influential, particularly in politics. And you see, I have mentioned how the Glorious Revolution was basically engineered by the middle class, because the middle class gained power, the middle class gained prominence. You can also have reference to the merchant in the general prologue of the Canterbury Tales by Chaucer. But merchant as a class, with their ability to exercise power, emerged in the 18th century. So in the social strata, the noblemen by birth and the landed gentry stood at the top, whereas the artisans and the rural workers were in the lower stratum of the society. Even in Tom Jones, you have these features of 18th century can be discussed if we talk about Tom Jones. Now, this is the historical context against which we will try to read the English Enlightenment. As I said, is the name usually attributed to an intellectual movement of the 18th century, though some critics, very rightly trace the roots of the Enlightenment to a period as far as the 13th century, which can be traced back in the works of Thomas Aquinas, who showed a kind of renewed interest in Aristotelian logic. Now you see that why this 18th century was putting some kind of stress on reason. Now, reason is the be-all and end-all of 18th century. Now, before 18th century, you have read about the Renaissance, which is associated with effusive excess. Now you see that from the excess of the Renaissance, Europe wanted restraint, control, form, symmetry, balance, order. We no longer need that kind of excess. So what we need? We need reason. We need restraint. We want to liberate ourselves from the shackles of the superstition and guidance. Immanuel Kant, a major philosopher of the 18th century, in his famous essay, What is an Enlightenment?, defined the Enlightenment as man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. Translations will vary. In some translation, you will find that man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. So we are not liberating ourselves. Cowardice is a vice. We are cowards. And therefore, we lack the courage to know and can't emphatically underline the fact that the motto of the Enlightenment was sapere aude, dare to know. You are gathering courage to embark on a journey to explore unknown territories. And you will see that usually when you read other, texts, other periods of history of English literature, you do not have, many names for one period. But this age has multiple names. Earlier, it's an old-fashioned term, though, but you extensively used the age is usually called the Restoration and the 18th century literature. The second term that you will perhaps hear is the neoclassical period. The third is, as I have already said, and Harinanda has also given in the title of the lecture, is of course the age of enlightenment or enlightenment. The fourth is the long 18th century. So if I ask you to date 18th century, then you will immediately tell me that 1700 to 1800. So this is something, you see, a layman can also say. But we as students of literature will usually categorize the long 18th century from 1660 to 1832. 1660 to 1832. Now people may vary. Some people think that 1688 should be the date. And the famous Victorian critic Matthew Arnold categorized the age as an age of prose and reason. So you see, all these terminologies will, almost not all these are terminologies, some of these terminologies are partial assessment of the age. And I argue that the better terminology to designate the age is either the Enlightenment or the long 18th century. Now, why am I saying this? Why am I saying this? Now, see that classicism, always want some kind of restraint and control. So the 18th century writers believed in the form of mimesis, which you know as imitation. But you see, in the context of neoclassical literature, there are two forms of imitation. One is the imitation of the older tradition derived from the Greek and Roman models. And the other is, of course, the ideas and thoughts of life that are getting translated into work of art, in the realm of art. So this imitation is taking place at two levels. So Augustan poetry is different from your expressive poetry. It's not behold her single in the field, yon solitary hide and lass. That is expressive poetry, subjective. Augustan poetry is essentially imitative in its nature, which represents human beings. Poetry is oriented towards society. The task of the poet is to interpret the social, the cultural, the political, and the economic forces of the time. And therefore, it is imitative, it is occasional, it is objective, it is didactic. Poetry does not only give you pleasure. The neoclassical artists believed in the concept of utile and dulce, borrowed from Horace. So the Horatian idea of utility, utile, and dulce, dulce, which means delight, is there. If you read the preface, Fielding's preface to Joseph Andrews, you will see that Fielding will continuously draw upon Horace's idea of combining delight with a utilitarian purpose. And you see that the novel, as the term novel as a distinct literary category, was not there in the initial half of the 18th century. Clara Reeve used it in the late 18th century, if I'm not mistaken, in 1765. And therefore, when Defoe was writing, when Fielding was writing, they were trying to define this new genre called the novel. The term novel was not there. And therefore, Fielding in Joseph Andrews, in the preface to Joseph Andrews, defined the novel as a comic epic poem in prose. You see, comic epic poem in prose. What Fielding is trying to do? He is trying to define the novel in terms of the pre-existing genres prior to the emergence of the novel. Because it was a new genre altogether. In poetry too, this utility and the delight has to be combined. If you read Dryden's Macflecknoe is not a mere lampoon. It's a broader commentary on the transforming culture of the Restoration, the culture of transformations that were taking place in the terrain of the Restoration England. So it can also be read as the anxiety of a neoclassical artist from high culture over the emergence of counterculture, what we call today a kind of counterculture. Now, coming back to this neoclassical aesthetics, you see that neoclassical aesthetics is occasional in the sense of specific set of people. If you read Macflecknoe, you need to know the rivalry between Shadwell and Dryden. Now, who was the royal poet or not? What was their political affiliation? And you also know about the rape of the law. Now, who did what? Without the occasion of the poem, you cannot read it. The conflict between the two families. So Pope was a Roman Catholic, living outside London, addressing these issues. Now, Pope was also very optimistic about, this Enlightenment. And, if you read Macflecknoe, The Rape of the Lock, you have already seen that extensive use of what I call heroic couplet, or what all historians have called. Rather, it's not my term. So you will see that iambic pentameter, last words rhymed. It was close to the dignity and solemnity of epic diction. So why heroic couplet is extensively used? Heroic couplet is extensively used to add solemnity, sublimity. Poetry essentially social in its impact. So pleasure would be, from recognizing parallels. It is elusive as well. So poetry get to the audience through intellect, not through only originality, but the way it is being written. And if you read Pope's essay on man, which encapsulates the spirit of the Enlightenment, the style of the poem is aphoristic. Because, that poem will encapsulate entire philosophical notion of man, generated during this Enlightenment period. So early Enlightenment concept of man as being the repository of reason. So man is able to judge. Man is outside the domain of prejudice. Because man has come out from clutches of religion, Pope is optimistic about the progress of rationality and the position of man in the society in Essay on Man. And adopting a style that is succinct, that is precise, that is aphoristic. So he encapsulated the entire philosophy of reason and rationality and explored the position of man in the context of the universe. So we have reason, so optimistic part of the Enlightenment is progress. Moving out from the clutches of superstition and religion. So this universe moves. Man captured and retained progress through the talent of the gift of reason. We have reason and therefore we have knowledge of the self, which is actually the knowledge of man. So if you want to understand human evolution, you have to understand man as a species. Now Shakespeare in Hamlet also said, what a piece of work is man. The Renaissance introduced this concept of the anthropocentric view, moving away from the theocentric model. And the Enlightenment took it one step further with the unflinching faith of Augustine humanism in the discourse of reason. This is how reason dominated and reason wanted some kind of control. Now, if I then categorize the 18th century on the basis of this assessment as 18th century as the neoclassical period, am I doing proper justice to the period? Because you will see that slowly the age of reason will move towards the cult of sentimentality and sensibility. If you read Gray's Elegy written in the country church, if you read Collins, if you read Cowper, even in novel, if you read Tristram Shandy, or a text with which all of you are familiar is Gulliver's Travels. Now, all these texts will can give you ideas that are not perhaps compatible with the poetics of neoclassicism. So if you read the pre-romantics, if you read even Alexander Pope's use of sylphs in the Rape of the Lock, which is part of Rosicrucian Enlightenment, which believed in magic, tiny creatures, which cannot be always explained rationally, you will see that this age also used some kind of forms of poetry which were at loggerheads with the principles of neoclassicism. And therefore, the assessment of the age as only neoclassical age is partial. This is equally true if you assess the age as in terms of the assessment of Matthew Arnold, and if you call the 18th century only as the age of prose and reason. Now, yes, there was a symbiotic relationship between reason and prose. Even poetry became like prose. Biography was there, periodical essay was there, and scientific writings are coming. You see, your addition is trying to enliven wit with morality and morality with wit through the Spectator papers. One of the basic aims of the Spectator paper was to bring the philosophy out of schools, libraries, and colleges down to the tables of the clubs and coffee houses. So you are talking about philosophy while taking a cup of coffee in your club or coffee house. That was the objective behind writing the Spectator papers, which also had some germination of the novel as well. Now, this 18th century was not merely the age of prose and reason. As I said, the age was moving towards the age of sensibility. You cannot explain Pope's use of sylphs, the supernatural machinery, through the kind of philosophy of reason that Pope himself talks about in the Essay on Man. If you remember that Gulliver, extinguished the fire by urinating on the fire. It produces laughter, but it bursts the balloon of pride of the English nation in the overarching, presence or belief in reason. Imagination began to be there. It's not that imagination was not there. Unreason began to have some kind of space, even in the later half of the 18th century. The emergence of the Gothic fiction, the castle, the description of the castle will create a sense of medievalism that will transport you to the dark recesses of the medieval period. And therefore, in spite of having some kind of faith or dominant principle of rationality, unreason had a space. Counter discourses had its space. Gray was there, Collins was there, Thompson was there in literature. Even if you think in terms of philosophy, then the people we usually talk about, the rationalist school and the empiricist school while talking about 18th century philosophy. The rationalist school of René Descartes and the empiricist school of John Locke. Now, most of you know that Descartes was trying to, make philosophy or to, to theorize in philosophy in very scientifically. They reduced the gulf between science and philosophy. And who talked about the famous phrase, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. I think, therefore I am. What is the essence of your existence? Now, when Locke came, Locke, put emphasis on experience. He conceptualized human mind as tabula rasa. তোমার মনে কিছু লেখা নেই, তোমার মনটা হচ্ছে একটা মুছে দেওয়া স্লেটের মতো। ওই স্লেটে যখন লিখবে তখন তোমার মনে লেখা হবে। এই মনে লেখাটা কে করবে? Experience. So knowledge can be gleaned from experiences of life. This life is not a mere platform for the contemplation of metaphysical things. It is not a preparation for the good or bad things that we are going to face in our afterlife. We have to engage with here and now. Contemporaneity is important. Therefore, you cannot read things that you can see in Renaissance prose romances. You cannot have read the depiction of the aristocratic, people in Sydney's old Arcadia or new Arcadia. The middle class people wanted to read something where they can have the reflection of their own life, their own struggle, and therefore novel came. And what the famous theorist talked about, how the novel came due to three factors: the rise of the novel, rise of literacy, and the rise of the middle class. So what talked about this triple rise theory. What I wanted to underline is that apart from reason, there were certain strings of thought that were at loggerhead with the paradigm of rationality. Now, if you read Tristram Shandy, you can see how the discourses of reason and the narrative of linear progression has been disrupted. So unreason had its own model, and you see many critics during that time, like even Immanuel Kant Immanuel Kant, in Critique of Pure Reason, alerts us to certain oversteps of reason and science. And Critique of Judgment almost placed imagination as an active cognitive faculty that connects sensibility with understanding, and the experience of the sublime arises from simultaneous feelings of finitude of imagination and the power of reason. So Kant is there. Even Vico, Hammond, Harder, they were also coming out from the rubric of the reason. And therefore, I think that the categorization of the 18th century, following the opinion of Matthew Arnold as the age of prose and reason, is equally partial, like the neoclassical one. So the better terminology to designate is this age is, of course, the Enlightenment or the long 18th century. Enlightenment or the long 18th century. So this is another, and is very important, this acknowledgement of the partiality of the ways it is being seen. Now, you see that another aspect of the Enlightenment that I will talk about is, of course, the development of the science. It is true that, though I should have mentioned it earlier, that the 18th century witnessed the tremendous development in science and technology, and most of you know this very well. In 1662, the Royal Society was established, and with the establishment of the Royal Society, science got a strong foothold during the 18th century. Science got a strong foothold. And this scientific attitude, the rational attitude, laid down the paradigm of what we call now modernity. This scientific attitude laid down the paradigm of modernity. And there were many other things that came. You see that Newton came. Laws of mechanics revolutionized science. Now, Newton showed new model, laws of light, optics. So passing of light to the lens. Now, most of you know that Bible began with the statement, God said, let there be light. And you can, I'm just quoting this so that you can feel how science was important as a discipline in our discussion of 18th century. Now, God said, let there be light, and all was light. This is our Bible. Now, Alexander Pope came and said, God said, let there be light, let there be Newton, and all was light. You see, God is getting replaced by Newton as scientist. Many other things almost revolutionized this age. Discovery with Harvey, came the system of circulation of blood. You have the discovery of species and genus, steam engine, locomotive. And now all knowledge is accessible to man. Human mind is opened. A paradigm shift. in science, political thought, philosophy, rampant rise of print culture. You are communicating your ideas. The prose style is getting changed. You are not writing in a convoluted manner. You are trying to adopt a plain and simple style.
Afran Ahmed, something is creating disturbance. Please don't allow him inside the meeting. I'm removing him. Okay.
The block
No,
done.
continue, please. Okay.
Okay. So there was this kind of, a kind of validation of science. It was trying to validate science, and it created an idea of the machine. Machine. The idea of human body as machine comes. So notion of the machine as a probable utopian gadget that could revolutionize human society. Industrial revolution began. You are no longer following your system of agriculture as the only mode of production. And you can understand how the economic ideas, how the myth of the economicals during the Enlightenment can be seen in Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. It's a text that traces the economic ideas that took place during the Enlightenment. Now, literature explored what the society was, what the the ways political and economic ideas were present there. Now, another thinker that I must talk about is, of course, associated with the political philosophies, of course, Hobbes. Now, Hobbes in Leviathan in 1651, argued how in a state of nature, human beings are very, marked by selfish interest, and they are always engaged in conflict and rivalry. And Hobbes put it in a famous way: man is poor, solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. Now, this Hobbesian scheme can be traced back in Restoration comedies, even in a play like The Way of the World. The materialistic spirit can be seen, how marriage is seen as a kind of social contract, and the spirit of materialism runs throughout the text. There are many other texts that can support this document. Now, you see, I have tried to point out the complexities within the Enlightenment, and so far more or less talked about the good sides of the Enlightenment. You see that when you are reading your newspaper in the morning, just thank you, Enlightenment, because the Daily Cormorant was the first English newspaper that came during this period. So, the basis of what we call nowadays modernity lies in the Enlightenment, or let me put it in this way. The Enlightenment laid down the paradigm of modernity. The paradigm of modernity. Now, without the Enlightenment, we can't think of the modernity that we are now talking about. So, these modernity, this discourse of modernity has been contested as well as it has been supported. Now, many people think that our overemphasis on reason has caused havoc in human society, and enlightenment has taught this. One is that this enlightenment has erased the biocentric view of the world and increased only anthropocentric view of the world, centralizing man who can dominate and exploit the entire world. So nowadays, I am just going to talk about in a very simple way some drawbacks or lacuna that are latent within the enlightenment. So you see that if you are talking about an eco-friendly atmosphere, then you will not perhaps support the discourses of the enlightenment, because it has taught to look at nature not as nature per se, but as natural resources. Everything is a resource that can be accessed, that can be exploited. So you see, and it foregrounded anthropocentric view of the world, and the dominance of the anthropocentric world was so much so that you cannot just put forward a kind of biocentric view of the world where you can also feel some kind of sympathy for the animals and other human beings, living beings here. You will see that industry was there. Therefore, there was huge destruction of the green. I've initially told you that the rights, the individual liberty of man was created, but you cannot delink the enlightenment from its association with colonialism, which exploited, which thrives on the exploitation of the other human beings. The opulence of England is actually the result, the fruit of the sweat of the non-Europeans, as once upon a time Franz Fanon put it. So there was a demand for manpower, and they talked about the abolition of slavery and created an alternative way of enslaving the entire world. So the wealth of nation, the free trade that Adam Smith was talking about. So this wealth of nation, was not profitable for all nations. But colonialism, created a space for the plundering of the wealth of nation of the non-Europeans. Political democracy. Well, speaking about political democracy, yes, political democracy was there, but not in the true sense of the term. It was not fully achieved. Political stability keeps aside antagonism. There was no universal adult suffrage. It was very selective. So the first step of democracy was, of course, taken, but not fully achieved. Myth of superiority was circulated at the cost of the degeneration of the other. And as I said, Swift castigated the whole idea of reason. Man is not animal rational being. Man is rationis capax, capable of reason. So some of the doctrines of rationality, civil society, secularism on the basis of life was there, but the Enlightenment had its own drawbacks and acted as a source of power of European nations to dominate the world. It was a male European white phenomenon. And therefore, the entire world did not come under the rubric of the Enlightenment. Only the Europeans harnessed the profit. If we even think in this way, we will see that nowadays, especially you are also reading theories, with the rise of high theory, there is a marked tendency to critique and question the principles of the Enlightenment. Foucault is there, Derrida is there, of course, other postmodernist writers are there. Even Spivak did it. Now, if you remember, I told you that Kant defined the Enlightenment as man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. Now, Spivak will come and will criticize, Kant, because you see that the words that we are using is man. So the narrative of the Enlightenment is marked by the dominance of man and marginalization of women. But the Enlightenment, of course, came up with the idea of the rise of the professional writers. You have your Aphra Behn, you have your Mary Wollstonecraft, who can argue that women will submit or surrender to the discourse of reason, not to men. So reason has a liberating potential. It can liberate you from the clutches of patriarchy. So though women, did, Wollstonecraft provided a kind of critique of the traditional role of woman in society, and are, therefore put forward a kind of more inclusive and just view of the society where women are seen as rational individuals with agency and equal rights. So Enlightenment, of course, initiated these discourses. But, it could not completely eradicate the dominance of patriarchy. As Spivak has said, that this conceptualizing Enlightenment as a white male European phenomenon, there is a certain sort of understanding that the hero of this scenario, of the narrative, the knowing subject, has in fact the Western man. This is what Spivak is trying to say. Now, Foucault is, of course, also critical about Kantian position, has wrote an essay, and it is seen as a kind of response to Kant's What is Enlightenment, where he talks about a kind of critical attitude, critical engagement with the Enlightenment, and talks about the blackmailing of the Enlightenment. But that essay is quite interesting, Foucault is not altogether, but of course, I am talking about only in the context of that particular essay, is repudiating the Enlightenment altogether. He says that there is no logic in always being for or against the Enlightenment. So Foucault was also trying to address the complexities of the Enlightenment. And the major, text that when you will grow up, people will talk about is Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer's text, The Dialectic of the Enlightenment, where they argue that the fully enlightened art is a disaster triumphant. So this enlightenment, provided a conduit for the exploitation of the others, and they criticized this view of the Enlightenment. People usually club both Adorno and Horkheimer under the term counter-enlightenment with the publication of the book by Isaiah Berlin. But you see that dialectic, the term dialectic is not always counter. It is both negation and acceptance. Therefore, I have some reservations to categorize them as the spokespersons of the counter-enlightenment. But of course, they contested some of the ideas of the Enlightenment. Now, the problem is that, as I said, with the rise of high theories, we are interested in only in the critiques of the Enlightenment, CRITIQUES, rather than a sustained investigation in the Enlightenment as a social and cultural phenomenon per se. And why am I saying this? If you read carefully some of the basic premises of post-colonialism or postmodernism and their repudiation of the Enlightenment, you will see that many criticisms that they put forward as new were already available in the thinkers of the period. So they are talking about one particular facet of the Enlightenment and missing out the other. Therefore, following, almost my favorite theoretician, Jürgen Habermas, who wrote a famous article titled Modernity and Incomplete Project, where Habermas, talked about this, that, you cannot repudiate Enlightenment altogether. So repudiating the Enlightenment is almost an analogous act of throwing away the baby along with the bathwater. যখন কোনো একটা বাচ্চাকে স্নান করা, বাচ্চাটাকে কি জলটা স্নান করানোর পর বাচ্চাটাকেও ফেলে দাও, জলটাকেও ফেলে দাও, না শুধু জলটাকে ফেলতে হবে? So Habermas suggested that if modernity proves disastrous to us, we need to address the drawbacks of the modernity, and we need to delve deep into the reasons why this particular discourses of modernity is becoming disastrous for us. And Habermas gave his famous model that our life world is getting disintegrated into three compartments: scientific, technological, legal, moral, and aesthetic. শিল্প একদিকে যাচ্ছে, প্রশাসন একদিকে যাচ্ছে, প্রশাসন, ল, এগুলো সব একদিকে যাচ্ছে, আর সাহিত্য আর একদিকে যাচ্ছে. And these are getting detached from the moodings of everyday life. These are not interacting with each other. This is where the problem lies. Should science engage itself in the pure pursuit of knowledge? তাহলে E is equal to mc square হবে, অ্যাটম বোম হবে, হিরোশিমা নাগাসাকি ধ্বংস হবে. And if science can interact with the legal, moral, and the administrative structures and then come with the same formula, then perhaps modernity won't be so disastrous. So my suggestion is that, almost following Habermas, yes, of course, we are aware of the hegemonic discourses of the Enlightenment. But it's not that all the discourses associated with the Enlightenment are negative and need to be rejected altogether. We need a thorough, systematic analysis of the discourses of the Enlightenment. And if we do so, we will see that we can discover many dialogic strains within the Enlightenment, where reason can be a dominant, maybe a dominant, trend, but unreason, sensibility, feeling. Henry Mackenzie was writing Man of Feeling, were all there. Logic was there, superstition was there. The Pope is writing about man's position in the universe, man's capability to achieve human perfectibility, to achieve perfection through exercising reason. The same Pope can use supernatural machinery in the name of the law. It is this dialogic strain that should be brought out as readers of the Enlightenment. I end here, and if you have any query, I will try to answer. Yes. Any question? Hello? Any question? Arnab, are you there?
Yes, I'm there. Sorry.
No, sir.
One second.
No,
Yes.
sir. No, sir.
If anybody have any question, you can ask. কারোর কোনো প্রশ্ন থাকলে বলতে পারো এনলাইটেনমেন্ট পিরিয়ড নিয়ে। এত সুন্দর কম্প্রিহেন্সিভ একটা লেকচার। থ্যাংক ইউ অর্ণব ফর দ্যাট। ইউ হ্যাভ টাচড বলো সুপারবো।
স্যার ট্রান্সন্যাশনালিজমটা কি যদি একটু বলে দেন।
ট্রান্সন্যাশনালিজম বলতে আমি যেটা বলতে চাইছিলাম যে এনলাইটেনমেন্ট ওই একটা জায়গা জুড়ে তো হয়নি, বুঝতে পেরেছো? আমরা সাধারণত ধরে নিই, আমরা যেহেতু ইংরেজি সাহিত্যের ছাত্র, আমরা ইংল্যান্ডটাকে ধরে নিই, ঠিক আছে? ট্রান্সন্যাশনাল এই কারণে বলছিলাম, এনলাইটেনমেন্টের আইডিয়া গুলো বিভিন্ন জায়গায় স্কেটার। ধরো ফ্রেঞ্চ থিঙ্কারদের ছাড়া, ফ্রেঞ্চ ফিলোসফসদের ছাড়া আমরা এনলাইটেনমেন্টকে ভাবতেই পারি না। আবার স্কটিশ যে মডেল আছে, ইংলিশ মডেল আছে, জার্মানদের একটা আইডিয়া আছে, স্প্যানিশদেরও আইডিয়া আছে। এইরকম করে এই এতগুলো মানে নেশনের আইডিয়াকে এক জায়গায় করে আমরা এনলাইটেনমেন্ট শব্দটা বলি। অ্যাকচুয়ালি এনলাইটেনমেন্টস ইটস প্লুরাল, অনেক কিছু হওয়া উচিত, কিন্তু সেটাকে আমরা ক্যাপিটাল দিয়ে একটাকে সিঙ্গুলার ফর্মে ইউজ করি। ওই যে বিভিন্ন নেশন থেকে যেহেতু আইডিয়াস গুলো বরোড করে একটা কালচারাল ফেনোমেননকে আমরা তৈরি করছি, এই জন্য এটাকে ট্রান্সন্যাশনাল বলার চেষ্টা করছি।
Enlightenment is a pan European intellectual movement এবং এর ফলে এক্স্যাক্টলি এর ফলে এটাকে একটা জায়গায় আনার জন্য আমরা ক্যাপিটাল ই দিয়ে করছি, কিন্তু জাস্ট লাইক রোমান্টিসিজম ইজ নট আ সিঙ্গেল মুভমেন্ট, রোমান্টিসিজমস সেরকম এনলাইটেনমেন্ট একটা মেনি মুভমেন্টস এর একটা মাল্টিপল মুভমেন্টস এর একটা ফলাফল। রাইট। আর কারোর কোনো প্রশ্ন আছে? 18th সেঞ্চুরি নিয়ে আর কারোর কোনো প্রশ্ন?
স্যার এই এজটাকে কি এজ অফ রিজনও বলে?
হ্যাঁ বলে, কিন্তু যেটা আমি বলছিলাম, এজ অফ রিজনটা হচ্ছে একটা পার্শিয়াল অ্যাসেসমেন্ট অফ দি এজ। এজ অফ রিজন অ্যাকচুয়ালি বলা হয় এজ অফ প্রোজ অ্যান্ড রিজন, ওই ম্যাথু আর্নল্ড বলেছিলেন বলে। কিন্তু অবশ্যই রিজনের একটা বড় রোল এনলাইটেনমেন্টে ছিল এবং তার ডমিনেন্সও ছিল, কিন্তু সেটা যদি শুধুমাত্র তো সেটাকে দিয়ে এনলাইটেনমেন্টকে বিচার করা যায় না। তোমরা তো এই পর্যন্ত লক করেছো, তাহলে তুমি সিলফ দে সুপারন্যাচারাল ইউজ সুপারন্যাচারাল মেশিনারিকে কিভাবে এক্সপ্লেন করবে? তাহলে শুধু এজ অফ রিজন নয়, এটাই আমার বলার বক্তব্য ছিল। যদি শুধু এজ অফ রিজন বলো তাহলে সেটা হবে একটা পার্শিয়াল অ্যাসেসমেন্ট অফ দি এজ।
খুব ভালো, খুব ভালো, ঠিক ঠিক, একদম ঠিক, দারুণ বলেছো।
আমি পড়ার মধ্যে থেকেই চুজ করলাম, কারণ হচ্ছে এটা তোমাদের বুঝতে সুবিধা হবে বলে তোমরা যে টেক্সট গুলো পড়েছো সেখান থেকে এক্সাম্পল দেওয়ার চেষ্টা করছি।
ঠিক ঠিক ঠিক। Any other questions? বেশ, আর যদি কোনো প্রশ্ন না থাকে তাহলে by giving thanks to Dr. Arnab Chatterjee for such a excellent presentation and such a comprehensive overview of the Enlightenment period. কেবলমাত্র Enlightenment period নিয়েই নয়, তার বাইরে তার যে critic of the Enlightenment period from Foucault down to other post-structuralist critics, সবাইকে নিয়ে একটা comprehensive lecture বলার জন্য অসংখ্য ধন্যবাদ অর্ণবকে। অর্ণব, থ্যাংক ইউ once again. Thank you so much. কখনো সুযোগ হলে অবশ্যই we will soon invite you physically in our college. তখন একদম বেশ, তাহলে তোমার সঙ্গে আমি লেকচারের পরে বাকি ফর্মালিটি গুলো নিয়ে কথা বলে নেব। আর বাকি সমস্ত স্টুডেন্টদেরকে বলি, থ্যাংক ইউ এভরিওয়ান for remaining present in this lecture. We have a second lecture by Bidhan Mondal which will begin around 2:30 PM, তাই তো? 2:30 করি, আড়াইটার সময় লেকচারটা শুরু করি। দুটোতে কথা ছিল, আধ ঘন্টা পিছিয়ে দিলাম। ইয়েস, আধ ঘন্টা, থ্যাংক ইউ সুনিতা, আধ ঘন্টা পিছিয়ে দিলাম। and we will start around 2:30, 2:10-15 থেকে একটু আস্তে আস্তে করে জয়েন করে যাবে। আর একজন একটু প্রবলেম ক্রিয়েট করছে দেখতে পাচ্ছি, হয়তো ডেলিবারেটলি। আই এম ট্রাইং টু ব্লক হিম আউট, বাট তোমাদের সবাইকে বলছি একটা নির্দিষ্ট টাইমের পরে লেকচারে আর কাউকে অ্যালাউ করবে না, যে সমস্ত কো হোস্ট রয়েছে তাদেরকে বলছি। So thank you. The feedback form will reach your WhatsApp group very soon, and আমরা অর্ণবকে জানিয়ে রেখে আমরা একটু কোয়েশ্চেন আনসারও করছি। এনলাইটেনমেন্টের উপরে কয়েকটা কোয়েশ্চেন আনসার করে ওদেরকে গুগল ফর্মে জিজ্ঞেস করছি, এঙ্গেজ করার জন্য আরো বেশি করছি এই লেকচারে। তো হ্যাঁ, তো এই সেশনটাও বিধানের লেকচারের পরে হবে। So thank you everyone. We are ending this session here. We will meet around 2:30 PM. Thank you Arnab, thank you everyone.
Thank you.
কোনো কারণে I am not able to end this call. কেউ একটু কলটা শেষ করো তো, পরমেশ্বর।
হ্যাঁ স্যার, ঠিক আছে।
রেকর্ডটা অফ করবেন না?
স্যার রেকর্ডিংটা অফ করুন।
রেকর্ডিংটা অফ